Okay, today we are diving deep into a single, really pivotal event from 1865, the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica. What's staggering about this one is how an uprising in this, small Caribbean parish, it didn't just shake the colony, it became this huge moral and political test for the entire British Empire. It actually split some of Britain's greatest thinkers right down the middle.
Yeah, and it's so important to get the timing right. This all kicks off about 3 decades after Britain formally ended slavery. But, for most free Jamaicans, that promise of freedom, it felt pretty empty. They were systematically kept off the land, stuck in, well, just grinding poverty, and shut out of any real political voice. The old system just kind of morphed.
Right, one form of control replaced by another. So our mission today is to really unpack how that systemic injustice boiled over into this pretty brutal clash, and then how the colonial reaction to it forced this unprecedented debate back in London. We want to figure out why this local fight went global. Let's start with the basics, maybe. The conditions facing the black majority, that sort of tinderbox situation. We know the white planter class, maybe not as rich as before emancipation, but they still completely dominated politics,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. They held all the cards. And they kept that grip through some uh, pretty deliberate structural barriers. Land ownership was key, obviously key to any kind of independence, but it was kept just out of reach for most people. It really stifled any chance of, getting ahead. And politically, the way they kept people disenfranchised, it was cleverly done in a cruel way.
You mean the poll taxes, those
Yeah.
voting requirements?
Exactly. You had to pay a tax to vote. Now, the amount on paper might not look huge to us now, but for people earning almost nothing, unable to get land, struggling to survive day to day, it was impossible. So that one rule just, boom, barred the vast majority of black Jamaicans from voting. It kept the planters firmly in charge of the local assembly.
Okay, so you've got people locked out of voting, locked out of land ownership, and then on top of that, you throw in this wave of economic disaster just before 65. The sources mention floods, droughts, ruining
Yeah.
crop.
Crop failures were massive.
Yeah.
And then disease outbreaks too, cholera, smallpox sweeping through. So rural poverty wasn't just bad, it became absolutely catastrophic right then.
And it's out of that desperation that leaders like Paul Bogle emerge.
Right. Bogle was a Baptist deacon from a place called Stony Gut. And his church, it wasn't just for Sunday service, it was a hub, for political organizing, for education, for resistance. He used that moral standing, that community base, to challenge the system.
And he did try the peaceful route first, didn't he? The sources talk about this incredible effort in August 1865. He walked, nearly 45 miles to Spanish Town, the capital, to personally deliver grievances to the governor, Edward Eyre.
He did a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
And Eyre. He just refused to even see him, wouldn't grant him an audience. And that refusal, that complete dismissal from the top, it basically confirmed what Bogle and others already suspected, that the system wasn't going to offer them justice. There was no path through the official channels.
So that rejection just cranked up the tension massively, which brings us to the immediate trigger, October 7th, 1865.
Yeah, things were already on edge. Then a man linked to Bogle's group protested during a local trial, got himself arrested. That led to an immediate clash with the police right there. And then warrants were issued for Bogle and his followers for rioting. That was really the spark.
And just 4 days later, October 11th, it all comes to a head at Morant Bay. Bogle leads several hundred people from Stony Gut down to the courthouse. They're aiming for a vestry meeting, basically where the local bigwigs were gathered. They wanted justice.
And they came armed, but mostly, with farm tools.
Mm.
Sticks, cutlasses, machetes, things they used every day. The local officials, though, they were expecting trouble. They'd already called up a volunteer militia.
The accounts seem pretty consistent. The violence kicked off when someone threw stones at the militia. And the militia's response: they opened fire straight into the crowd, killed 7 people right there on the spot.
Well, after years of frustration and now facing gunfire, the crowd just erupted. They sought back, overwhelmed the officials. They burned down the courthouse, other buildings nearby. And yeah, several local officials were killed in that chaos.
So for about 2 days, these rebels, as the authorities called them, they had control over parts of the parish, St. Thomas in the east, raiding police stations for weapons, attacking some plantations. It was this short, intense burst of fury.
Yeah, localized but fierce. By the time those initial clashes died down, about 25 people total had been killed on both sides.
But Governor Eyre's reaction, it was completely disproportionate, wasn't it? He didn't just want order restored.
No, this was about punishment. He declared martial law in the parish instantly, sent in troops under Brigadier General Alexander Nelson.
The goal seemed to be brutal retribution.
And here's a really complex and often painful part of the story. Eyre called on the Maroons for help. These were descendants of escaped enslaved people who'd signed treaties way back in 1739. Those treaties obliged them to help the British put down internal conflicts.
Right, they'd help suppress earlier uprisings, too. It's a complicated legacy.
Deeply complicated. Their involvement, fulfilling that old treaty obligation, made the suppression very effective, very swift, but it remains hugely controversial.
So, if the initial clashes killed around 25 people, the suppression that followed was on a whole different scale. The numbers are just shocking.
Absolutely devastating. The military clampdown was swift and incredibly harsh. We're talking over 400 people killed in the suppression. And crucially, many of those were executed with no trial at all, just summary executions.
400?
Plus, over 600 people were flogged, often brutally, or thrown in prison. And whole villages, like Bogle's own Stony Gut, were just wiped off the map, burned to the ground.
And the leaders, or perceived leaders, were dealt with quickly. Bogle himself.
Captured on October 22nd. Some sources say he was betrayed by informants from the area. He was executed just 2 days later under martial law, hanged alongside his brother Moses and about 14 others. Quick, decisive, meant to terrify.
But the execution that sent the biggest shockwaves, especially back in Britain, was George William Gordon's.
Yes, Gordon was a really prominent figure, a mixed-race landowner, a member of the legislature, a very vocal, very persistent critic of Governor Eyre and the whole unjust system.
And the truly outrageous thing about Gordon's case, he wasn't even in Morant Bay during the uprising, was he? He had no direct part in it.
None at all. And even worse, legally speaking, he was arrested in Kingston.
Which was miles away and, crucially, outside the area under martial law.
Exactly. But Eyre didn't care about the law. He saw Gordon as the real threat, the intellectual agitator, the one whose ideas supposedly fueled the rebellion. So Eyre had him illegally shipped to Morant Bay, specifically to bring him under military law.
Just to get him under martial law jurisdiction.
Right. Then he faced this rushed military tribunal. There was absolutely no credible evidence linking him to the violence. None. But he was convicted and hanged on October 23rd.
It's just incredible. A sitting legislator arrested outside the martial law zone, moved illegally, and executed on flimsy charges. That kind of blatant disregard for law, it didn't just cause outrage in Jamaica, did it? It had massive political fallout.
Oh, huge. The rebellion itself was crushed, yes. But Eyre's methods, especially Gordon's execution, put his administration under intense scrutiny back in London. The result? In 1866, the British government actually dissolved Jamaica's local assembly altogether. Ended that planter dominance, technically. But they replaced it with direct crown colony rule. Power shifted straight to British officials in London and their governor, which, didn't immediately help the black majority much either, just a different master, really.
Okay, and this is where the story takes that fascinating turn, isn't it? It shifts from being purely about Jamaica to being this major crisis of conscience in Britain. The ripples from Eyre's actions created this massive, unprecedented split among Britain's top intellectuals.
It really did. It polarized the intellectual scene like almost nothing before. You basically had two camps emerge, very public, very vocal. On one side, you got the Jamaica Committee, their main goal, prosecute Eyre for murder and abuse of power. They saw what he did as completely illegal, a betrayal of British justice.
And the people involved in that committee, it's like a who's who of liberal and scientific thought. John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, he was a key organizer. But also, unbelievably, Charles Darwin and other big names like Herbert Spencer, Thomas Huxley.
And Darwin's reason for joining is really telling. He wasn't, an expert on colonial policy, but he believed passionately in the rule of law. He felt Eyre had blatantly broken it, and that British justice had to apply equally everywhere, to everyone, regardless of race or where they lived in the empire. It was a matter of fundamental principle for him.
Wow. Okay, so that's one side. But there was a powerful group defending Eyre, too.
Oh, yes. The Eyre Defense Committee, set up specifically to protect him, argue his case, make sure he didn't face trial. And their membership was just as star-studded, but from a different corner of society. We're talking Charles Dickens, the novelist, Thomas Carlyle, the historian, John Ruskin, the art critic, huge figures.
Dickens defended Eyre.
He did. Their argument was essentially about order. They believed Eyre's harsh actions, even if legally questionable, were necessary to maintain control to preserve the empire. They genuinely feared that punishing Eyre would weaken colonial authority everywhere, maybe even encourage more uprisings. So for them, order trumped the letter of the law.
So this local rebellion forces this fundamental question in Britain. Is the purpose of the law to ensure justice, like Darwin argued, or is it primarily to maintain imperial power, like Dickens seemed to imply? The fact that it pitted Darwin against Dickens, it just shows you the scale of this thing. A fight in a small Jamaican parish echoed right through the heart of Victorian Britain.
Absolutely. It forced the empire to confront its own contradictions. In the end, though, the legal system kind of sided with power. A royal commission did criticize Eyre for using excessive force, but he was never actually prosecuted, never formally charged or convicted of any crime. The establishment protected its own, essentially.
But history's verdict, the moral verdict, seems pretty clear now.
I think so. The real legacy belongs to the people who fought for change. Paul Bogle and George William Gordon. They were eventually declared national heroes of Jamaica. They're remembered for their courage, for standing up for basic rights, for land, for justice, against this incredibly powerful and unforgiving system.
So, tracing that line from the systemic poverty and lack of rights through Bogle's Walk, the courthouse clash, the brutal crackdown, and then this huge debate in London. It's quite a journey.
It really is. And the Morant Bay Rebellion proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that emancipation on paper wasn't true freedom in practice. The struggle was far, far from over. It just exposed the deep hypocrisy at the heart of British justice when applied to its colonies. It showed that rights often had to be fought for, demanded, not just expected.
Which really leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. When the British establishment, faced with that clear choice upholding the rule of law and justice, as Darwin and Mill demanded, versus maintaining colonial order, as Dickens and Carlyle supported, ultimately chose order, when authorities prioritize order over justice like that, does the concept of the rule of law actually mean the same thing for everyone under their control? Or is it conditional? That's something worth mulling over.